Do you remember the Colonial Pipeline cyberattacks? They happened on May 6 through May 12, 2021, suspiciously close to the Russian Victory Day, one of the most celebrated holidays in the nation. The attacks led the company to immediately shut down its entire operation of 2.7 million miles of pipeline, delivering 100 million gallons of fuel a day to the eastern United States. The damage was so severe it threatened the supply of diesel and gas to mass transit, refineries, and other chemical operations. But it was also one of the most unsophisticated hacks you can think of. The attackers got access inside the corporate network via a single compromised password on an outdated VPN software with no second-factor authentication. If the business network was isolated from the pipeline operations, the company updated its software and used second-factor authentication, this attack wouldn't have happened. This wasn't even an act of cyberwar with the nation-state behind it. It was a ransomware attack by an extortion ring that just wanted to make some money. And even the hackers were too dumb to keep their Bitcoin in a cold wallet. More important than the damage from an embarrassingly bad security hygiene is the fact that this attack once again confirmed that if anyone wishes to wage a cyber war against the United States, they're basically facing kindergarten level of security awareness. There's a lot of fear messaging about an upcoming cyber Pearl Harbor, or an attack on an entire NATO alliance that will cripple critical infrastructure in all member states, sending the countries back to the 1800s. With such openly poor security practices, it makes one wonder, why hasn't it happened yet? It is likely because such a mass-scale cyber campaign isn't even practically possible. To understand what can be realistically done with cyber warfare, it serves best to look at the real world instead of hypothetical scenarios. One such cyber campaign was waged against one of the most digitally advanced countries in the world. It was the 2007 Cyberwar in Estonia. On April 26, 2007, Estonian government decided to remove a Soviet war memorial in Tallinn. It was this statue of the bronze soldier. For the large Russian minority, it commemorates the defeat of the Nazis in 1944. For Estonians, it is a symbol of Soviet oppression that followed soon after the war ended. The government decided to move the statue from its prominent position in the city center to a more quiet suburban area. Before the statue had a chance to be reallocated, thousands of ethnic Russians in Estonia took to the streets to protest and riot. During the 2 nights of the demonstrations, more than 1,300 people were arrested, 150 injured, and 1 person was killed. What followed on the night of April 27th would be forever embroiled in the memory of the young nation. A series of large-scale cyber attacks began hammering every prominent target in Estonia. Swaths of DDoS attacks took down major websites of political parties, first on the opposition side, then the government itself. Email spam overloaded communication servers of government employees, cutting their ability to communicate. Websites of the Estonian presidency, parliament, and its departments were taken down. 2 of the biggest banks and 3 of the country's news organizations were hit the same way. The next day, Estonians were unable to log into government portals. They couldn't pay in grocery stores. They couldn't check on the news online. Even print was behind because news outlets were unable to operate. Mobile phone networks crumbled. Estonia's entire infrastructure went down. Some websites were hacked and defaced with images of Soviet soldiers and pro-Russian messaging. Website of the Reform Party was taken over, and a fake letter of apology from Estonia's Prime Minister was posted on the front page. Botnets were targeting Estonia from locations all around the world, from Vietnam through Russia to the United States. Floods of junk messages shut down email servers of Estonian parliament. Hackers, whoever they were, overloaded Estonian infrastructure thousands of times over. This cyber offensive was severe and sophisticated. Attackers frequently changed their malicious server requests to evade filters and detection. In a distributed denial of service attack, Targeted servers are flooded with requests that overload their capacity to the point they can't serve benign users. These attacks can be spotted rather quickly and defended against by filtering the malicious requests from legitimate ones. It becomes more problematic when hackers take over remote devices of victims all around the world and use them for their offensive operation. The hackers that attacked Estonia that day used thousands of computers they had hijacked previously. These botnets were then all directed at once to flood internet addresses in Estonia. At the peak of the attacks, nearly 1 million computers hit Estonian targets. The severity of these attacks quickly alarmed the NATO alliance. Since Estonia is a member of the North Atlantic Defense Treaty, the ramifications of this cyber attack could be global. NATO quickly dispatched some of its best cybersecurity experts to Tallinn to investigate the attacks and help with the defensive. Another task was to determine a proper response. At the time, no one knew where the attacks came from. The hard evidence was not there. But if it could be established that the cyber attacks came from a nation-state, Article 5 of the treaty could be triggered. The Article 5 states that an attack on one member of the alliance is an attack on them all, and they should all respond in both defensive and retaliation. But without any conclusive proof of where the attacks came from, NATO refused to point fingers, and since the cyber attacks didn't cause a major loss of life equivalent to a traditional military action, retribution was called off. Estonians were not as prepared as they could have been for such a large-scale cyber incident, but their defensive team was quick and resilient. Estonia's computer emergency response team decided to block all foreign traffic coming to the country's servers. Protection of websites was prioritized based on their importance, and many Estonians volunteered to help businesses and websites scan through network activity logs and get back online. International aid from Slovenia, Germany, NATO, and EU provided Estonia's defense essential intelligence on the situation. Help from the government authorities and private IT sector was well coordinated, and the attacks were fended off after 3 weeks. This unprecedented computer offensive on Estonia became recognized as the world's first cyberwar. Now the only question remained: who exactly was behind it? The DDoS attacks eventually subsided as their botnet rants expired. Estonia was back on track. But the war wasn't over. This was a systemic attack on an entire nation-state, not just a single company or a handful of individuals. Everyone in Estonia felt the effects of the cyberwar during those 3 weeks. So the next move was to identify where the attacks came from, who ordered them, and go after the perpetrators. Estonian officials were quick to blame Kremlin. The attacks coincided with the removal of the bronze soldier statue, and they peaked during the May 9th celebration, one of the most significant holidays for Russians. But Moscow denied any involvement, saying Estonian claims were unsubstantiated, and they had a point. Estonia never provided any forensic evidence that would conclusively say the attacks were organized or originated largely from Russian headquarters. The first person to be convicted of taking part in the cyber war was a 20-year-old ethnic Russian Estonian. He was fined 17,500 kroons for an attack on the Prime Minister's website, which according to his defense was an act of protest against the Prime Minister. This person was a student and not connected to the Russian government in any way. He also had no prior criminal record. Some wanted to see the student as a mastermind behind the whole offensive, but with a level of sophistication and intensity, the Estonian cyber war must have been a collaborative effort involving multiple parties with plenty of resources. Estonian investigators said the largest part of the attacks came from Russian IP addresses, and some even originated from official servers of Russian authorities. It wouldn't be surprising if this was the case. Russian government had plenty of motive to do this. The two countries have a troubled history, and Russia has never fully given up on re-entering the Baltics since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before the removal of the bronze soldier, Russian government warned the decision would be, quote, disastrous for Estonians. When the statue was removed, Russia cancelled the train connection from Tallinn to St. Petersburg, removed the Estonian flag from its embassy in Moscow, and refused to provide Estonia any help during the cyber attacks. When a Russian delegation went to Tallinn to investigate the removal of the statue, they called on the Estonian government to resign. And then, during an interview with a Russian journalist, Sergei Markov, a State Duma deputy, told the moderator not to worry about the attacks, that they were carried out by his assistant, but refused to give out his name so that he wouldn't be denied visas. What? Estonian Defense Ministry didn't take these claims seriously and played them down as just a joke. And it probably was just a Russian joke. In reality, only one IP address originated from a Russian government computer. And again, nobody seriously believed that a single mastermind hacker could be behind such a large-scale offensive. But what is weird about Markov's claims is that his assistant supposedly carried out the attacks from an unrecognized republic, which most likely hints at a Russian-populated region in a European country that doesn't want it to secede. That's oddly specific. One such contested region is Transnistria, mostly Russian-populated parts of Moldova. That's where Konstantin Galaskov, a member of Nashi activists, a pro-Kremlin youth group, admitted to being involved. Galaskov said the hacking was done from Transnistria and that Russian offices weren't used at all. Nashi has a long history of organizing protests against Estonia, and there are active foot soldiers in the cyberspace. One of the most bizarre aspects of the cyber attacks was that the perpetrators' plans were actually posted all over Russian-speaking forums and chat groups. They openly discussed their next targets, types of attacks, and who should get involved. Instructions on how to send disruptive requests to Estonian websites began quickly circulating all around the Russian blogosphere. This was happening in real time as the attacks were going on. So what likely happened was that Russian hackers with ties to Kremlin provided their expertise and resources to Russian groups online and enticed the mob to coordinate under decentralized command and control. Many of the enraged Russian hackers and cyber rioters most likely didn't even know who they were communicating with, but their outrage over the statue removal was too large to remain inactive. This theory was even corroborated by the Kaspersky Lab, an antivirus software company. Their research concluded that the culprits were most likely young techies, possibly script kiddies or hackers who spontaneously grouped together on the night of the Bronze Soldier attacks. As the fog of the cyber war cleared out, this theory became more and more plausible. Some even called the offensive on Estonia a cyber riot instead of a war. It is undeniable that an online mob definitely took part, but it doesn't disprove Russian government involvement. A year later, Russia declared a war on Georgia, another post-Soviet nation neighboring Russia. This was a full-scale ground offensive, but it was coordinated with cyber attacks similar to ones that occurred in Estonia. Government and media websites were taken down, telephone lines were jammed, and Georgia's internet went dark. In 2008, Georgia was not a member of a military alliance, so maybe the only thing that saved Estonia from a ground invasion was their NATO membership. 15 years went by and it still hasn't been established who exactly was behind Estonia's cyber attacks with conclusive evidence. NATO and EU refused to attribute these attacks to the Russian government without that hard evidence. The 2007 cyber attacks on Estonia are still considered the first full-scale cyber war on a nation-state, a war without declaration, attribution, or retaliation. On a side note, Estonia is single-handedly the most digitalized country in the world, which might lead many to think it makes them that much more vulnerable to cyber attacks. But Estonians would like to propose a different perspective. As a small post-Soviet nation, Estonia didn't have any infrastructure for its 1.4 million inhabitants in 1991. They didn't have sufficient economy that would support building roads and delivering government services to remote locations. So Estonia voted for the most cost-effective solution: make everything on the internet. By 1997, Estonia effectively became the first fully functioning e-government. Every school was connected to the internet. Free Wi-Fi access points were established all over the country. Self-service was encouraged, and now Estonians can do almost everything digitally. They can sign government documents with their digital ID card from the comfort of their home. They can file tax returns, pay fees, and vote for parliament online. The only actions where physical presence is required are marriage and funeral. Estonia rolled out end-to-end encryption to single government ID cards issued to all citizens, with strict compartmentalization of citizen data. The ID card holds private keys to their health record, insurance, driving licenses, passport information, or employment data. But government offices can only access data relevant to their departments. During a routine police stop, officers can only see your driving license and car insurance information. For everything else, they need a warrant and a judicial grant. Similarly, doctors can only see records patients allow them to. The same goes for any other government department. Estonia set up sovereign data embassies all over the world to back up government services even in case Estonia would be physically taken over by an occupying force or wiped out by a nuclear attack. The country has one of the fastest and most stable internet infrastructure in the world. This doesn't make it more susceptible to cyber attacks. It makes it a lot more expensive and time-consuming for attackers to do sufficient damage in Estonia. It is a lot easier to take down poorly maintained servers than ones with the highest bandwidth and backup capacity available. There is virtually no paperwork in Estonia. Internet makes the country run more efficiently and cost-effectively, and because of this, Estonia realizes the importance of internet security perhaps more than any other nation. The country now has thousands of cyber volunteers ready to help defend the country in case of a next cyber offensive. It is far from perfect, but it would be hard to find a country more resilient to cyber disruptions than Estonia. Cyber warfare is now an integrated part of military strategies of every major nation. The most high-profile case of an active cyber engagement alongside the use of kinetic force was the cyber war on the Islamic State. In 2016, the US Department of Defense publicly admitted they used cyber attacks to interrupt ISIS command and control, compromise and overload their networks, and intercept their communications. These attacks were coordinated with the coalition of Iraqi and Kurdish forces to recapture the city of Mosul in Iraq. Independently of the US military, anarchic hacker collective Anonymous also initiated cyber attacks of their own as a revenge for terror attacks in Europe. Nation-states are stockpiling cyber weapons in their arsenals of software vulnerabilities and exploits in a Cold War-like cyber arms race. In 2017, the arsenal of the National Security Agency was breached by shadow brokers, a mysterious hacker group that released roughly 300 megabytes of data from the US top spy agency. Among many of the exploits publicly dumped on the internet was a Windows 0 Day dubbed Eternal Blue. And even though Windows had already released a security patch for it, someone decided to build a ransomware worm to infect outdated Windows machines. And they were successful. The ensuing WannaCry ransomware infected over 200,000 victims in 150 countries in just a few days. It was one of the most virulent malware ever launched, and was only stopped by chance by a security researcher in the UK. The phase of the cyber war will most likely take the form of skirmishes that take days or weeks at a time. A full-scale campaign on an entire nation's infrastructure is only a viable threat to smaller countries mostly without military alliances. Waging such a massive cyber campaign is most effective when coordinated with kinetic force, but on its own, cyber offensive will eventually run out of resources and time, and the defense will adapt. The cyber war in Estonia was successful mostly because it likely had hundreds or thousands of spontaneous participants, but Estonia's economy didn't crumble, and the society bounced back to normal quickly after the attacks were fended off. Much of the damage can be prevented by simply following good security hygiene. You can learn a lot on how to improve your online security, from securing your online accounts to encrypting your data, by following my security tutorial playlist. My work is free from sponsorship and affiliates, so your support on Patreon is essential to keep this channel alive. Stay safe and don't panic.